On the evening of March 12, 1947, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat in a private booth at the Copacabana nightclub in Midtown Manhattan, one of the most glamorous establishments in New York, a place where Frank Sinatra performed, where politicians and movie stars mingled with businessmen and gangsters, and where the line between legitimate society and the underworld was so blurred that nobody bothered trying to distinguish one from the other, waiting for a meeting that would either secure Harlem's independence for the next 2 decades or would trigger a war that would destroy everything the neighborhood's black gangsters had built since Prohibition ended. Johnson was 40 years old, had just been released from Sing Sing prison after serving a decade for drug trafficking, and had returned to find Harlem transformed. More prosperous than when he'd left, controlled by a new generation of black gangsters who'd maintained the autonomy he'd helped negotiate with Al Capone nearly 20 years earlier, but who now faced a threat more sophisticated and more dangerous than Dutch Schultz had ever been. A threat that couldn't be resolved through the old agreements because those agreements had died with the men who'd made them. But Johnson faced a problem that the younger gangsters didn't understand. The world had changed. The arrangements that had protected Harlem during Prohibition, the understanding that black gangsters would pay tribute to Italian families in exchange for territorial autonomy, had been based on personal relationships between Johnson and Capone, between Johnson and Lucky Luciano, between men who'd known each other, who'd negotiated face to face, who'd built trust through years of cooperation. Those men were gone now. Capone was dead. Luciano was in exile in Italy. The old commission leadership had been replaced by a new generation who'd never met Bumpy Johnson, who viewed the Harlem arrangements as relics of an earlier era, and who saw the post-war heroin trade as too lucrative to respect territorial boundaries that had been drawn when the biggest racket was policy gambling. The man Johnson was waiting for was Frank Costello, 56 years old, the most powerful Italian gangster in America in 1947. The de facto boss of the Luciano family, the prime minister of the underworld, who controlled politicians from city councilmen to judges to congressmen, who'd transformed organized crime from violent street gangs into sophisticated criminal corporations, and who represented everything that was different about the post-war mob, more business-minded, more politically connected, more willing to cooperate with other ethnic groups when cooperation served their interests, but also more ruthless about eliminating arrangements that no longer made financial sense. Costello had requested this meeting, had sent word through intermediaries that he wanted to discuss the Harlem situation, had made it clear that the old arrangements were being reviewed, that the commission was considering whether maintaining black autonomy in Harlem was still profitable given the opportunities in heroin trafficking, and that Johnson, as the last surviving link to the original agreements, needed to make a case for why those arrangements should continue. The invitation was both an opportunity and a threat. An opportunity because Costello was willing to negotiate rather than simply taking what he wanted. A threat because if Johnson couldn't convince Costello that preserving Harlem's autonomy served the commission's interests, the alternative was war. And Harlem couldn't win a war against the combined resources of New York's 5 families in 1947. If you have the courage to hear this story, click here to find out what happened. But I warn you, the details reveal how organized crime actually evolved in post-war America, how the heroin epidemic that would devastate black communities was shaped by negotiations between black and Italian gangsters, and how Bumpy Johnson's greatest achievement wasn't surviving prison or building a criminal empire, but was preventing a mob takeover that would have destroyed Harlem's last vestige of self-determination in the criminal underworld. This narrative explores how Bumpy Johnson returned from prison to find Harlem's criminal landscape transformed. How Frank Costello recognized that the post-war world required new arrangements between organized crime families. How the two men negotiated a deal that would govern Harlem for the next 20 years. How this secret agreement created the structure that allowed black gangsters to control heroin distribution in their own neighborhoods rather than being displaced by Italian families. How the partnership between Johnson and Costello, one that built on the foundation laid by Capone, but adapted it to post-war realities, shaped both Harlem's future and the trajectory of American organized crime in ways that historians are only now beginning to understand, now that both men are dead and the consequences of their decisions have played out across decades. The Copacabana on East 60th Street was neutral territory, not a commission headquarters like the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, not a Harlem establishment where Johnson would have home advantage, but a glamorous nightclub where mobsters and celebrities mixed so freely that nobody would notice two middle-aged men having a conversation in a back booth. Security around Costello had been intensified in the post-war years after rivals had attempted to assassinate him, after Costello had learned that being the most powerful gangster in New York also made him the most hunted, after the Kefauver Committee had begun investigating organized crime and making top mobsters into public figures whose faces appeared in newspapers and whose movements were watched by federal agents. So when Bumpy Johnson arrived at the Copacabana at 8:17 p.m. on March 12, 1947, he was taking a calculated risk. Johnson was a black man entering an establishment that catered to white customers, in an era when racial segregation was still absolute in much of America, when most New York nightclubs wouldn't serve black customers, regardless of how much money they had, when showing up at a meeting with Frank Costello without proper authorization would normally result in being beaten or killed rather than being granted an audience. But Johnson wasn't unauthorized. He'd been expected, had been granted safe passage, had been told by Costello's representatives that he could come to Manhattan to discuss Harlem's future, and that he'd be allowed to leave alive regardless of whether Costello accepted or rejected whatever proposition Johnson might make. Johnson was escorted through the nightclub by two of Costello's associates, large Italian men in expensive suits, who said nothing, but who watched Johnson carefully, looking for any sign he might be armed or might be planning an attack. Johnson had been searched once already when he'd entered through the kitchen entrance, and he carried no weapons, wore a tailored suit that marked him as someone with money and status, and maintained the calm expression of a man who understood he was completely at the mercy of people who could kill him at any moment, but who believed the potential rewards justified the risk. The private booth where Costello waited was in the back corner of the club, was positioned so that Costello could see everyone who entered while remaining partially obscured from the main floor, and had drinks laid out on the table, expensive scotch, the kind that Costello preferred, and that demonstrated his sophistication and his distance from the crude bootleggers of the Prohibition era. Costello sat against the wall, wore one of his signature conservative suits that could have belonged to a banker or a lawyer, and was alone, which surprised Johnson because most commission bosses traveled with bodyguards and advisors, but which also signaled that Costello viewed this as a private conversation rather than an official commission meeting. "Mr. Johnson," Costello said, standing to shake hands, a gesture of respect that Johnson had learned to expect from the Italian mobsters, who'd known him before his imprisonment, but that still felt remarkable given the racial dynamics of 1947 America. "Welcome back to the world. I heard you kept your mouth shut in Sing Sing." didn't cooperate with prosecutors, didn't give up any names. That's the mark of a man who understands our business. Please, sit. We have things to discuss. Johnson sat carefully, maintaining the respectful but not submissive demeanor that had served him throughout his criminal career. He needed to show respect for Costello's power without appearing weak, needed to demonstrate that Harlem's black gangsters were still serious players, worthy of negotiating with, rather than being dismissed as relics of an earlier era who could be swept aside. "Mr. Costello," Johnson began, his voice steady, despite understanding that the next hour would determine whether Harlem maintained its autonomy or whether the commission would move to take over the neighborhood's criminal operations entirely. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me. I understand the commission has concerns about the Harlem arrangements, and I'm here to address those concerns and to propose modifications that I believe will benefit both your families and our operations." Costello poured scotch, offered a glass to Johnson, and smiled. Not the warm smile of someone greeting a friend, but the calculating smile of a businessman evaluating a potentially obsolete asset. "I'll be direct with you, Bumpy. The old arrangements made sense when Al was running Chicago and when Lucky was running our family. Those were different times. Prohibition was ending. The big money was in policy gambling. And frankly, the Italian families didn't understand the colored neighborhoods well enough to run operations there efficiently. So paying you 15% to maintain order, to keep the peace, to let you run your own territories, that made business sense. But it's 1947 now. The world's different." Johnson sipped his scotch, waiting for Costello to continue, knowing that interrupting would be a mistake. "Here's the situation," Costello said, leaning forward. "Heroin is the future. Not gambling, not numbers, not any of the old rackets. Heroin. The boys are bringing it in through Marseille, through Corsican connections, through routes we established during the war. We're talking about a product that generates 10 times, 20 times the profit margins of anything we made during Prohibition. And you know where the market is? It's in the colored neighborhoods. It's in Harlem. It's in Chicago's South Side. It's in Detroit's black communities. The colored population has money now, has jobs from the war industries, and they're looking for escape from the same poverty and discrimination they've always faced." Costello paused, studying Johnson's reaction. "So the commission is asking, why should we continue paying Harlem to control its own territory when we could be making hundreds of millions from heroin distribution in those same neighborhoods? Why should we respect arrangements from the Prohibition era when the economics have changed so dramatically?" This was the moment Johnson had been preparing for since his release from prison, the moment when he would either save Harlem's autonomy or would watch it disappear. "Mr. Costello," Johnson said, meeting Costello's eyes directly, not backing down. "I understand exactly what you're saying. Heroin is profitable. The colored neighborhoods are the market. And from a pure profit perspective, you're asking why the commission should share that profit with us when you could take it all. But let me tell you why maintaining our arrangement with modifications serves your interests better than taking over Harlem's operations entirely. First, you need to understand what happened in Harlem while I was in prison. The younger operators, the guys who took over while I was away, they've built sophisticated distribution networks. They know every building, every apartment, every user in their territories. They've got relationships with corrupt cops, with building superintendents, with everyone who matters for running heroin distribution efficiently. If you come in and try to replace them, you'll be starting from scratch. You'll be white gangsters trying to operate in colored neighborhoods where you don't understand the social dynamics, where you don't have the relationships, where your presence will attract attention." Johnson pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket, placed it on the table. I had my people prepare an analysis of what Dutch Schultz spent trying to take over Harlem's policy game in the 1930s. He spent hundreds of thousands monthly on enforcers, on bribes, on violence, and he failed because he didn't understand our neighborhoods. Now, imagine trying that same approach with heroin, which is federally illegal, which attracts much more serious law enforcement attention, which requires much more sophisticated distribution networks. You could do it. You've got the resources, but the cost would be enormous, and the disruption would reduce profits for years while you figured out how to operate effectively. Costello picked up the document, scanned it, but didn't respond immediately. Now here's what I'm proposing, Johnson continued, and this was where the negotiation became crucial. Harlem maintains autonomy over heroin distribution in our territories. We source the product from your suppliers. We pay you wholesale price plus a distribution fee, and we handle all street-level operations. This gives you profit from supplying the heroin without any of the risk or cost of street-level distribution. You make money from every package we sell, but you don't have to worry about the dealers, the users, the police raids, the violence that comes with street-level operations. Costello leaned back, thinking. The proposition made some business sense. The commission would profit from supplying heroin to Harlem without the costs and risks of direct distribution. But the political implications were significant. You know what you're asking? Costello said quietly. You're asking the commission to let colored gangsters control the heroin trade in their neighborhoods. You're asking us to share the most profitable racket in America with operators we could theoretically eliminate. You're asking us to trust that you'll maintain order, that you won't expand beyond your territories, that you'll continue respecting arrangements even though the economics have changed. Yes, Johnson said simply. That's exactly what I'm asking, and I'm willing to pay for it. What happened next was what made this meeting legendary. The twist that would remain secret for decades, that would change both men's lives, and that would alter the structure of Harlem's criminal economy forever. Costello stood, walked to the edge of the booth, looked out at the nightclub floor where musicians were setting up for the evening show, and was silent for nearly 2 minutes while Johnson waited to see whether Costello would accept or reject the proposition. Then Costello turned back to face Johnson and said something that shocked him. I accept your proposal, but not for the reasons you think. I'm not accepting because the business logic makes sense, though it does. I'm accepting because I've been thinking for months about how to handle the heroin situation. And you showing up here with the same solution I was considering tells me we're both seeing the same reality. Johnson stared at Costello, not understanding. Here's what I figured out, Costello continued, returning to the booth. The Kefauver Committee is investigating organized crime. They're going to hold hearings. They're going to subpoena commission members. They're going to make our faces famous, make us into public enemies. Make it much harder to operate the way we've operated since Prohibition. The heat is coming, Bumpy. Real heat. Federal heat. And when that heat comes, the commission needs operations that don't lead directly back to us. Costello sat down, looked directly at Johnson. Heroin distribution is going to be the most profitable racket in America, but it's also going to be the most dangerous. The federal government is going to crack down. They're going to make examples of dealers. And if the commission is directly involved in street-level distribution, we're all going to prison. But if we're just suppliers, if we're removed from the actual distribution by layers of colored operators who handle everything from wholesale to retail, that gives us distance. That gives us deniability. That protects the commission. Johnson was stunned. Costello wasn't just accepting Harlem's proposition. He'd apparently reached the same conclusion independently, that allowing black gangsters to handle heroin distribution while Italian families supplied the product was actually the smart play, that it provided both profits and protection in the coming era of increased federal scrutiny. "So here's my counteroffer," Costello said. "Harlem handles all street-level heroin distribution in your territories. You buy from our suppliers at wholesale price plus 30% markup. That's your tribute, built into the pricing structure. In exchange, the commission guarantees that no Italian families will compete in your territories. And if you get arrested, you handle your own legal problems without expecting commission intervention. We're suppliers, you're distributors. We maintain separation that protects both sides." The room felt different now. What Costello was proposing was continuation of the old arrangements, but adapted to new economic realities. It was recognition that black gangsters had value not just as subordinate operators, but as buffers between the commission and federal prosecution. "If I agree to this," Johnson said slowly, "if Harlem becomes the distribution network for commission-supplied heroin, what happens when the younger operators want more? What happens when they see how much profit we're generating and they decide they don't want to pay 30% to Italian suppliers anymore? What happens when someone tries to source heroin independently?" Costello smiled. "That's where you come in, Bumpy. You're going to run Harlem. You're going to enforce the arrangements. You're going to make sure the young guys understand that the 30% they're paying is buying them more than just product. It's buying them protection from other families. It's buying them warning about federal investigations. It's buying them the right to operate without commission interference. And if someone tries to go independent, if someone tries to source heroin outside our supply chain, you're going to handle that internally. You're going to make an example that reminds everyone why the arrangements exist." Johnson looked at Costello, understanding that he was being offered both enormous power and enormous responsibility. The chance to control Harlem's heroin trade, to become the gatekeeper between the commission and the street-level dealers, to build wealth and influence that would make him one of the most powerful black gangsters in American history. But also the burden of enforcing arrangements that would fuel the heroin epidemic, that would destroy thousands of lives in black communities, that would create the very devastation he'd be profiting from. "I need 24 hours, Johnson said. "This is bigger than what I expected when I came here. I need to talk to my people, need to make sure the major operators will accept these terms, need to understand if I can actually enforce what you're asking me to enforce." "Of course," Costello said. "Take your time. But Bumpy, you should understand something. This offer is good for 1 week. After that, the commission proceeds with alternative plans for Harlem. And those alternative plans involve us moving into your territories directly, which means war, which means destruction, which means the end of the autonomy you've maintained since the Prohibition era. I can wait. The commission can wait. But Harlem doesn't have time. So you need to decide fast." The stakes in the Costello-Johnson negotiation extended far beyond the immediate question of who would control Harlem's heroin trade. At issue was the fundamental structure of post-war organized crime. Whether black gangsters would maintain the autonomy they'd achieved during Prohibition, or whether the commission would centralize control over the most profitable criminal enterprise in American history. The business implications, the financial stakes, were staggering. Heroin trafficking in New York was generating approximately $50 million annually in the late 1940s, making the drug trade more profitable than bootlegging had ever been, making it territory worth fighting for, but also making it dangerous in ways that policy gambling had never been. The cost of direct distribution was escalating. Italian families that tried to operate street-level heroin networks in black neighborhoods were losing men, were attracting federal attention, were making minimal progress toward building the relationships and knowledge needed to run efficient operations. The alternative revenue model that Costello proposed, supplying heroin to Harlem at wholesale plus 30% markup, could generate $15 to $20 million annually with minimal risk, providing stable income that didn't require direct involvement in the street-level operations that attracted the most law enforcement scrutiny. The buffer from prosecution that black distributors provided could protect commission leaders from the federal investigations that were coming, potentially saving them from the prison sentences that would otherwise devastate their families. From a pure business perspective, Costello's proposal made enormous sense. More money, less risk, better insulation from prosecution, sustainable long-term model. The social implications. But the social implications were devastating. Heroin was destroying black communities. The drug that had been relatively rare before World War II was becoming epidemic in Harlem, on Chicago's South Side, in every major city's black neighborhoods, creating addiction, destroying families, fueling crime that terrorized law-abiding residents. What Costello and Johnson were negotiating would accelerate that destruction, would create formal mechanisms for flooding black neighborhoods with heroin, would make black gangsters complicit in poisoning their own communities, would build fortunes on the backs of addicts who had no other escape from poverty and discrimination. The moral weight of this was staggering. Johnson understood that accepting Costello's deal meant becoming the architect of Harlem's heroin epidemic, meant profiting from addiction and death, meant collaborating with the commission to create distribution networks that would devastate the neighborhood he'd grown up in. But refusing the deal meant war, meant the commission would take over Harlem anyway, meant black gangsters would be displaced and the heroin would flow regardless, except without black control, without black profit, without any possibility of minimizing the harm. This was the impossible choice that made the Costello-Johnson negotiation so significant. There was no good option, only different degrees of complicity and tragedy that was coming regardless. The power dynamics. The negotiation also revealed shifts in organized crime's power structure. Costello held overwhelming leverage. He controlled commission resources, could direct multiple families against Harlem, could eventually win through sheer application of force, even if the victory was expensive. But Costello also recognized limits on power. Winning might cost more than it was worth. Taking over Harlem might succeed militarily, but fail economically if the commission couldn't operate effectively in neighborhoods they didn't understand. The distribution arrangement created mutual dependence. Black gangsters would need commission suppliers. The commission would need black distributors. Both sides would profit. Both sides would be vulnerable, creating incentive for cooperation. But dependence was unequal. The commission controlled supply. Black gangsters handled the dangerous work. The relationship preserved hierarchy while acknowledging that black gangsters had value beyond simple subordination. This dynamic, mutual dependence within hierarchical structure, was what made the Costello-Johnson arrangement potentially sustainable in the post-war era, even as it transformed the nature of organized crime's relationship with black communities. To understand the Costello-Johnson meeting, one must understand the historical context. America in 1947, 2 years after World War II ended, at a moment when the nation was being transformed by economic prosperity and social change, but also at a moment when organized crime was being fundamentally reshaped by new opportunities and new threats. The post-war context World War II had ended in 1945, and by 1947, its effects on American society and organized crime were clear. Economic boom, wartime production had created full employment, had brought millions of Black Americans from rural South to urban North, had put money in working-class pockets for the first time in decades, creating market for consumer goods both legal and illegal. Social transformation. The war had begun to break down some racial barriers, had demonstrated that Black Americans could serve with distinction, had created expectations for greater equality that would eventually fuel the civil rights movement. Though 1947 was still a decade before Brown v. Board of Education and nearly 2 decades before the Civil Rights Act. But also persistent segregation. Most of America remained rigidly segregated. Black Americans faced discrimination in employment, housing, education, faced violence in the South, and de facto exclusion in the North, creating frustration and desperation that made drugs appealing as escape. Heroin availability, wartime disruption of drug trafficking routes, had been followed by post-war establishment of new routes, particularly through France and Marseille, creating unprecedented supply of high-quality heroin that was flooding into American cities. This context meant that 1947 was a pivot point. The old Prohibition-era arrangements were becoming obsolete. The new drug economy was emerging, and the question was whether Black gangsters would have any role in controlling what happened in their own neighborhoods, or whether they'd be displaced entirely by Italian families who saw heroin as too profitable to share. The Commission context. The Commission, formed in 1931 to organize Italian-American crime families nationally, had evolved significantly by 1947. Lucky Luciano's exile. Luciano had been deported to Italy in 1946 after his conviction was commuted in exchange for cooperation during the war, leaving a power vacuum that Frank Costello had filled. Costello's ascendance. Costello represented a new type of mob boss, more politically connected, more business-minded, more willing to operate through corruption rather than violence, more sophisticated than the Prohibition-era gangsters. Kefauver threat. Senator Estes Kefauver's Special Committee to Investigate Crime in Interstate Commerce would begin hearings in 1950. But by 1947, organized crime leaders already knew that federal scrutiny was intensifying, that the old days of operating with impunity were ending. This meant that the Commission in 1947 was both more powerful and more vulnerable than it had ever been. More powerful because it had consolidated control over most criminal rackets in major cities. More vulnerable because federal law enforcement was developing tools and political will to prosecute organized crime leaders in ways that hadn't been possible during Prohibition. The Harlem context. Harlem in 1947 was experiencing both prosperity and crisis. Cultural flowering. The Harlem Renaissance had evolved into a broader cultural significance, with Black artists, musicians, writers making Harlem the center of Black American culture. Economic growth. Wartime employment had brought money to Harlem, had created Black middle class, had made the neighborhood more prosperous than it had been during the Depression. But also emerging drug crisis. Heroin was beginning to appear in Harlem in quantities that hadn't existed before the war, creating first waves of addiction epidemic that would devastate the neighborhood over the next 3 decades. Criminal autonomy. The arrangements negotiated between Bumpy Johnson and Al Capone in 1928, maintained by Johnson and Luciano through the 1930s, had given Harlem's Black gangsters control over policy gambling, prostitution, and other rackets in their territory, creating unusual degree of Black economic self-determination, even if it existed within criminal economy. This context made the Costello-Johnson negotiation existential for Harlem. If the old arrangements ended, if the Commission took over heroin distribution directly, Black communities would lose one of the few areas where they had genuine economic control, even if that control existed in illegal markets. After Bumpy Johnson left the Copacabana on the night of March 12, 1947, to consult with Harlem's major operators about Costello's proposal. After those operators, understanding they had no real alternative, authorized Johnson to accept the Commission's terms. After Johnson returned to meet Costello 4 days later and formalized the agreement, the real work of building the new arrangement began. The structure. Over the next several weeks, Costello, Johnson, and representatives from the other Commission families worked out the detailed structure of Harlem's heroin distribution system. Territory, Black gangsters, would have exclusive control over street-level heroin distribution in Harlem, in Brooklyn's Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood, in other predominantly Black areas of New York, with similar arrangements to be established in other cities where Commission families operated. Supply monopoly. All heroin would be sourced exclusively from Commission suppliers, primarily the Luciano family's connections to Corsican traffickers in Marseille, with no independent sourcing permitted under any circumstances. Pricing structure. Harlem operators would pay wholesale price plus 30% markup, with the 30% representing tribute to the Commission, providing approximately $15 million annually to the Luciano family alone. Distribution hierarchy. Bumpy Johnson would serve as primary coordinator between Commission suppliers and Harlem street-level dealers, would be responsible for maintaining order, for preventing independent operators from violating the supply monopoly, for ensuring that tribute payments were made consistently. Protection and isolation in exchange for tribute. The Commission would prevent other Italian families from competing in Harlem's heroin trade, would provide advance warning of major federal investigations when possible, but would maintain complete separation from street-level operations, refusing to provide legal assistance to arrested dealers or to intervene in local law enforcement matters. Enforcement mechanisms, violations of the supply monopoly, attempts to source heroin independently, or failures to make tribute payments would be handled by Johnson and Harlem's enforcement apparatus, rather than by Commission enforcers, preventing violations from becoming interorganizational conflicts. Secrecy provisions. The arrangement would be known only to top leadership of both the Commission families and Harlem's major operators, would not be discussed in any context where conversations might be recorded or overheard, would be maintained through informal understandings rather than through any written agreements. This structure was sophisticated, more sophisticated than most legitimate business arrangements in 1947, and demonstrated that both Costello and Johnson understood that the post-war heroin trade required careful organization to be profitable while minimizing the risk of federal prosecution. The challenges implementing the arrangement faced several major obstacles. Convincing younger operators. Johnson needed to convince Harlem's younger gangsters, many of whom had built their operations while he was in prison, that paying 30% tribute to Italian suppliers was acceptable, that the arrangement provided genuine value rather than being simple exploitation. This required Johnson to demonstrate that the Commission's protection was real, that territorial autonomy was worth the cost, that attempting to operate independently would trigger Commission response that would destroy their operations entirely, preventing independent sourcing. The arrangement's profitability for the Commission depended on maintaining supply monopoly, but independent operators consistently attempted to source heroin from other suppliers, from returning servicemen who'd developed Asian connections during the war from any source that would eliminate the 30% tribute. This required enforcement. Johnson personally handled several violators in 1947 and 1948, using violence that demonstrated that breaking the supply monopoly was not tolerable, creating examples that discouraged other operators from attempting similar independence. Managing federal heat, the FBI and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics were intensifying enforcement against heroin trafficking, were making arrests, were building cases against major dealers, creating risk that arrested operators might cooperate with prosecutors to reduce their sentences. This acquired careful management of information. Street-level dealers knew only their immediate suppliers. Mid-level operators knew only that heroin came from Italian sources, but didn't know specific commission connections. Only Johnson and a handful of top operators knew the full structure, limiting what could be revealed if anyone cooperated with law enforcement. Maintaining commission distance, Costello's strategy of using black distributors as buffer required genuine separation between commission suppliers and street-level operations. But that separation created communication challenges, coordination problems, and occasional misunderstandings about pricing or supply. This required Johnson to serve as effective intermediary, translating between the commission's business approach and the street-level reality of Harlem's drug trade, managing conflicts before they escalated. The implementation, through late 1947 and into 1948, the arrangement was implemented across Harlem and expanded to other cities. Bumpy Johnson established himself as Harlem's primary heroin coordinator, meeting regularly with commission representatives to arrange supplies, coordinating with street-level dealers to manage distribution, enforcing the monopoly through violence when necessary. Heroin flow increased dramatically. By 1948, Harlem was receiving approximately $50 million worth of heroin annually at retail value, with approximately $1 million going to street-level dealers and Harlem operators, and $15 million going to the commission as tribute built into the wholesale markup. The violence was substantial but controlled. Johnson handled approximately 8 enforcement actions in 1947 to 1948, eliminating operators who'd attempted independent sourcing or who'd challenged his authority, demonstrating that the arrangement would be maintained regardless of resistance. The commission maintained distance. Italian families received tribute payments through laundered channels, had no direct contact with street-level operations, successfully insulated their leadership from the heroin trade in ways that would prove crucial when federal investigations intensified in the 1950s. Similar arrangements were established in other cities. Black gangsters in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and other major cities negotiated parallel agreements with their local commission families, creating national structure where black operators controlled street-level heroin distribution while paying tribute to Italian suppliers. By 1940, the Costello-Johnson arrangement was functioning smoothly, was generating enormous profits for both the commission and Harlem's operators, and was demonstrating that the post-war drug economy could be organized along the same territorial lines that had governed Prohibition-era cooperation between white and black gangsters. The Costello-Johnson arrangement had consequences that neither man fully anticipated when they made the deal. Consequence 1, the heroin epidemic accelerated. The efficient distribution network that Johnson built for the commission created devastating heroin addiction in Harlem and other black communities. By the mid-1950s, Harlem had an estimated 25,000 heroin addicts, approximately 1 in 10 residents, creating social catastrophe that would define the neighborhood for decades. Crime rates soared as addicts stole to support their habits, as dealers fought over territory, as the violence inherent in the drug trade spilled into residential areas. Families were destroyed as fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters became addicted, as productive members of society became desperate addicts, as the social fabric of black communities was shredded by the drug that Johnson and Costello had agreed to distribute. The economic impact was perverse. While dealers became wealthy, the broader community became poorer as money that should have circulated in legitimate businesses instead went to drug purchases. Addiction reduced workforce participation, as the stigma of being a drug neighborhood made legitimate economic development nearly impossible. This consequence, the human cost of the arrangement, was the tragic legacy that neither Johnson nor Costello adequately considered in their 1947 negotiation. Consequence 2. Black organized crime achieved financial power, but moral bankruptcy. The heroin arrangement made several black gangsters extraordinarily wealthy. Johnson himself accumulated millions of dollars, invested in legitimate businesses, became a significant economic force in Harlem. Other major operators similarly built fortunes that they used to buy real estate, to fund black businesses, to create economic infrastructure in black communities. But that wealth was built on addiction and death, was fundamentally parasitic on the very community it claimed to serve, created a criminal elite that profited from neighborhood destruction. The moral contradiction was inescapable. Black gangsters were simultaneously community leaders, providing loans that banks wouldn't provide, funding businesses that created jobs, supporting families in need, and community destroyers, distributing the heroin that was devastating those same families, creating the addiction that made legitimate economic development nearly impossible. This contradiction, wealth built on destruction, power built on parasitism, defined black organized crime in the post-war era, and created legacy of ambivalence about figures like Bumpy Johnson, who were both neighborhood heroes and neighborhood villains. Consequence 3. The Commission achieved insulation from prosecution. Costello's strategy of using black distributors as buffer proved remarkably effective. When the Kefauver Committee held hearings from 1950 to 1951, when federal prosecutors built cases against commission leaders through the 1950s, the separation between suppliers and distributors protected Italian bosses from heroin-related charges. Arrested dealers were black, couldn't testify about direct commission involvement because they'd never had direct contact with commission leaders, could only describe the distribution structure that Johnson controlled. This insulation allowed the commission to profit from heroin for decades without facing the consequences that street-level dealers faced, created asymmetry where black gangsters went to prison, while Italian suppliers remained relatively protected, demonstrated that the arrangement served the Commission's interests even better than Costello had anticipated. The irony was bitter. The arrangement that preserved black autonomy in heroin distribution also ensured that black gangsters bore the legal consequences, while Italian gangsters collected profits with relative immunity. Consequence 4. Bumpy Johnson became legendary. Bumpy Johnson's role as coordinator between the Commission and Harlem's drug trade made him one of the most powerful and most controversial black gangsters in American history. He controlled access to heroin supply, making him indispensable to every dealer in Harlem, giving him authority that extended into every aspect of the neighborhood's criminal economy. He had commission backing, which made him nearly untouchable, gave him protection that allowed him to operate for decades despite periodic arrests and imprisonments. He became community figure, both feared and respected, viewed as protector by some and as destroyer by others, embodying the contradiction of black organized crime in the post-war era. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, his legacy was complex. He'd maintained black control over Harlem's criminal economy at a time when that control could easily have been lost. He'd built wealth and power that few black Americans achieved in the segregated mid-20th century. But he'd also been architect of the heroin epidemic that devastated Harlem, had profited from addiction and death, had collaborated with the commission to poison his own community. That complexity, hero and villain, protector and destroyer, made Johnson's story emblematic of the impossible choices facing black Americans in an era of limited legitimate opportunities. Frank Costello's conviction for contempt of Congress in 1952 and his subsequent legal troubles could have destabilized the arrangement, but instead it was absorbed into the commission's evolving structure. The transition. When Costello faced increasing legal pressure in the 1950s, when Vito Genovese challenged his leadership, when the commission's structure shifted, the Harlem heroin arrangement continued because it served everyone's interests. Bumpy Johnson continued coordinating distribution, but worked with whichever commission family controlled the Luciano organization's operations, demonstrating that the arrangement transcended personal relationships. The supply monopoly was maintained through the 1950s and 1960s. Commission families continued supplying heroin to Harlem operators, continued collecting tribute through the wholesale markup, continued benefiting from the buffer that black distributors provided. The persistence. The arrangement proved remarkably durable precisely because it served asymmetric interests effectively. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Harlem's heroin trade continued under the structure Johnson and Costello had established, generating enormous profits for both commission families and black operators, while devastating the community. Through the 1970s, even as Johnson died and new generations took over, the fundamental structure persisted. Supply monopoly maintained by commission control over international trafficking routes, distribution controlled by black gangsters in their own neighborhoods. Into the 1980s, elements of the arrangement continued, though crack cocaine would eventually replace heroin as the primary drug destroying black communities, and the relationships between Italian suppliers and black distributors would evolve into different forms. The end. The Costello-Johnson arrangement finally ended not through violence or prosecution, but through obsolescence, much like the Capone-Johnson arrangement before it. The decline of commission power. By the 1980s and 1990s, federal RICO prosecutions had devastated commission families, had eliminated leadership, had disrupted the organizational capacity needed to maintain supply monopolies. The rise of independent trafficking. Black gangsters in the 1970s and in the 1980s established direct connections to drug sources, particularly for cocaine and crack, making them less dependent on commission suppliers, creating truly independent black drug organizations for the first time. The changing economics. Crack cocaine in the 1980s was more profitable and easier to source than heroin had been. Created opportunities for independent operators who didn't need commission connections, made the old tribute arrangements seem unnecessary. By the early 21st century, the Costello-Johnson arrangement was historical artifact, remembered primarily by crime historians and by the few surviving old-timers who'd lived through the era when Bumpy Johnson and Frank Costello had reorganized Harlem's drug trade in ways that would shape the neighborhood for generations. The story of how Frank Costello and Bumpy Johnson negotiated the arrangement that would govern Harlem's heroin trade for decades reveals several uncomfortable truths about post-war America. The lesson about race and drugs. The Costello-Johnson arrangement demonstrated that the heroin epidemic in black communities was not random was not simply the result of individual choices or cultural pathology, but was structured by deliberate decisions made by both white and black gangsters who prioritized profit over community welfare. The Commission chose to use black communities as primary markets for heroin because those communities were vulnerable, were facing discrimination and poverty that made drugs appealing, and were underserved by law enforcement that might have interdicted drug trafficking more effectively in white neighborhoods. Black gangsters chose to collaborate in distributing heroin in their own neighborhoods because the alternative was losing all control to the Commission, because legitimate economic opportunities were severely limited by discrimination, and because the wealth that drug trafficking generated was one of the few paths to financial success available to black Americans in the 1940s and 1950s. This creates a devastating legacy. The heroin epidemic that destroyed black families, that created mass incarceration, that devastated black communities for generations, was partly the result of formal arrangements between organized crime leaders who understood exactly what they were doing and chose profit over community. The lesson about moral complexity. The arrangement reveals both Costello and Johnson as more complex than simple villains. Costello was capable of pragmatic business thinking, recognizing that using black distributors as buffers served the Commission's interests better than direct involvement in street-level distribution, demonstrating business acumen even while creating social catastrophe. He was willing to maintain territorial arrangements with black gangsters when it served his interests, suggesting that the Commission could be pragmatic about race when profitability required it, even while contributing to the destruction of black communities. Johnson faced impossible choices. Refusing Costello's deal would have meant Commission takeover of Harlem's drug trade anyway, would have eliminated black control without preventing the heroin epidemic, would have made the situation worse for black communities. Accepting the deal preserved some autonomy, generated wealth that stayed in black communities rather than being entirely extracted by white gangsters, but required becoming complicit in the destruction of those same communities. His legacy is therefore tragic. He was simultaneously protector of black autonomy and architect of black suffering, community leader and community destroyer, successful by conventional measures, but morally compromised by the nature of his success. The lesson about systemic problems. The Costello-Johnson arrangement demonstrates how individual choices operate within systemic constraints that limit available options. Costello and Johnson didn't create the heroin supply that flooded America after World War II, didn't create the poverty and discrimination that made black communities vulnerable to drug addiction, didn't create the limited legitimate economic opportunities that made drug trafficking appealing. But they created mechanisms that channeled those systemic problems into specific communities in specific ways that magnified the harm. They made choices that worsened situations they didn't create, but could have mitigated. And their choices had consequences that extended far beyond their own lives, shaping communities for generations. This reveals how organized crime both reflects and reinforces broader social inequalities, how criminal arrangements can institutionalize harm in ways that become difficult to undo, how individual agency exists but operates within constraints that make truly good choices sometimes impossible. If you found this exploration of the secret alliance between Frank Costello and Bumpy Johnson compelling, like and subscribe for more investigations into hidden organized crime history. Share this with anyone interested in post-war America, in the relationship between race and drugs, or in understanding how the heroin epidemic in black communities was shaped by organized crime, rather than being simply a result of individual choices or cultural factors. Comment below. Why do you think this arrangement remained secret for so long? How does learning about the Costello-Johnson deal change your understanding of the heroin epidemic in black communities? What does it say about American society that organized crime could formalize arrangements to distribute drugs, primarily in black neighborhoods? Until next time, remember history is more complicated than the simple narratives we tell. Frank Costello wasn't just a mob boss. He was a businessman who recognized that using black gangsters as distributors provided both profit and protection from prosecution. Who created organizational structures that allowed the commission to benefit from the heroin trade while maintaining distance from its consequences. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a Harlem gangster. He was a negotiator who preserved black control over Harlem's criminal economy when that control could have been lost entirely, who built power and wealth in an era of limited legitimate opportunities, but who also became architect of the heroin epidemic that devastated his own community. Their secret alliance, negotiated in a nightclub booth in Manhattan in 1947, reorganized Harlem's drug trade in ways that historians are only now beginning to understand, created distribution structures that fueled addiction for generations, and demonstrated that when profit is at stake, people will make choices that destroy communities even while claiming to protect them. The twist that Costello had been planning the same separation between suppliers and distributors that Johnson proposed, that he saw black gangsters as valuable buffers rather than just competitors to be eliminated, reveals a sophistication about criminal organization and about insulation from prosecution that contradicts the simple violence-focused narrative of post-war organized crime. And the consequences, the epidemic it accelerated, the wealth it created, the communities it destroyed, the moral compromises it required, demonstrate that this secret meeting had impacts that extended far beyond the immediate question of who would control Harlem's heroin trade, shaping American society in ways we're still grappling with today.